Hi guys, this is Kim from It Again Bookstore, and today we're with Lindsay Bandy, yeah, and Liza Nash Taylor. I say, it's best to start these things with a boo-boo so that later you won't make any. It's like get it out of the way, right? So, well, welcome guys. Both Lindsay and Liza have books that have come out recently from Blackstone Press. We've got Nemesis and the Swan and Etiquette for Runaways. So why don't you guys each tell us a little bit about yourself? Liza, why don't you go first?
Sure. Kim, thanks for having us here and having me back again. It's great to be back here. And yes, so my book came out in August, Etiquette for Runaways. It's set in 1924, and it's told in 3 parts in Virginia, New York, and Paris. And it's the story of a young woman's regret, ambition, and quest for redemption that takes her from rural Virginia to Prohibition era New York to Jazz Age Paris, and in search for answers to the question of how do we ask for forgiveness when we've intentionally deceived the people who love us most, and how do we forgive ourselves?
So, and I read it, it's good. Lindsay, your turn. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and then your book?
Sure. I'm Lindsay Bandy. So easy way to remember it. Bandy rhymes with candy.
We had the whole conversation about this before we started. I still got it wrong, but it's okay. Sorry.
It's candy with a B. Everybody gets it wrong. Don't even worry about it. So I am the author of Nemesis and the Swan, which is set at the height of the French Revolution. And it's a story of revolutions on a big scale in France, but also on a smaller scale, as the main character, Hélène, is to claim her own freedom and find who she wants to be in the middle of a lot of different kinds of voices telling her who she needs to be in society and from her family. So she's unraveling the mysteries of her estranged family, while at the same time she's in love with the jeweler's apprentice and trying to claim the life that she wants with him in the midst of the guillotine and all that crazy stuff. So that's a little bit about the book. I live in Eastern Pennsylvania, and I'm a mom. I have 2 daughters and my husband. I have 2 cats, and my cat will probably make another appearance and show you her tail at some point. But I also work as a youth librarian part-time, which I really enjoy. So it's been a challenge with COVID, but we're doing some online programming, and it's fun to be surrounded by kids and books.
So both of these are your first novels, right?
Yes.
Was it what you expected writing a novel? I mean, things are different because of COVID, but did everything you planned on happening, did it happen? Do you know what I'm saying? No.
No, when people can't go into a bookstore, or they have limited exposure to bookstores, they can't see your cover and say, oh, that looks interesting, and pick it up and look at it. And of course, live book tours didn't happen, and conferences and book fairs and things I was supposed to go to didn't happen. It was funny because this time last year, I guess I was starting to work on the cover of this book. Now I'm starting to work on the cover of my second book. But I was in February when COVID was just happening, I thought, oh, I feel so bad for those people who have books coming out in the spring and not knowing that by August, things would be worse. And now with when Lindsay's book is coming out, things are even worse. So, I just hope all of our families stay safe. And that's what's more important, of course. But it really is a horrible time to try to launch a book, especially your first book. What do you think, Lindsay?
Yeah, I've definitely not foreseeing that. And I think between that and all the election buzz and just, it's been a crazy year. But I think people are reading a lot more this year. They're home and they want that escape. So I think in some ways it's been good and bad, and some of the virtual events, while I like to travel and I'd love to be at Read It Again, it's still fun that I can be with you guys here virtually too. And I was actually really lucky to have a 75-degree day in February that I could do my launch party, or not February, in November, that I could do my launch party outside and get to see some friends. So we've been kind of making do and making it work, but it's definitely not been what we all dreamed of it being.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So both of you guys, your books take place in Paris. Liza, yours is the Roaring Twenties, and Lindsay, you're the French Revolution. What did research look like for you guys?
You go first, Lindsay.
Okay. Well, I started to get interested in the period when I was in college, and I took an art history class. That it was actually a 19th century art class, but we started a little bit before to give us that background of coming into the new century. And we started with the art of the French Revolution. And so that just kind of piqued my interest. It was something that I guess it was kind of a hole in my education. Like all I knew was, let them eat cake and off with their heads. And so I kind of started to get really interested in the lives of these young people who were living through such a wild and turbulent time. So I while I was still in college, I watched documentaries, I did some reading, and I just kind of learned and wrote some really bad drafts of scenes. And then I got married and had babies and was kind of reading here and there. So I did a lot of bits and pieces of research when I wasn't necessarily actively writing because, I was feeding babies and things like that. But once my kids got a little bit older, a little more independent, then I really sat down and I started to read Citizens by Simon Schama and The Days of the French Revolution by Christopher Hibbert. Some of those things really gave me a solid timeline. And then I love to look at vintage photographs and paintings, and I love interior design and fashion. So I had the idea that I wanted to have a character who was a jeweler or a jeweler's apprentice. So I started to research period jewelry. So I'd look on museum websites, on Pinterest, just wherever I could find stuff. And that's when I found the Lover's Eye jewelry that found its way onto the cover. And finding that really was the centerpiece for okay, now I know how I'm going to tie together my main characters past, present, and future. And so once I discovered that and learned the story behind it, I think the story really started to come together for me there. But I do research in a lot of different places. I look everywhere I can and just I'm a curious person. So I like to see and hear and touch and taste and read a lot.
Liza, I know you had some fun researching. We talked about this earlier.
Oh, yes. Well, the whole third part of my book, the part set in Paris, came about through research when I started looking into Josephine Baker's early life and career. And originally I had her as a character. So I spent a month in Paris. I think it was in 2016. My daughter was studying over there, and I did a writing retreat, and then I spent the rest of the time researching this novel. And the first place I started was the Théâtre des Champs-Élysées, where Josephine Baker premiered in Paris in 1925. And they were very gracious. They gave me a behind-the-scenes tour of the dressing rooms and the backstage. And so that was great. I mean, that always adds, I think, a lot to your sensory details when you've smelled it, when you've ridden in the elevator that is so slow that it's a running joke. And then I also worked in my favorite museum in Paris, the Musée Nassim de Commando, which was a private mansion. And it was left to the city of Paris with the proviso that it be left in situ. So it looks like the family is going to come back and sit down and have lunch the way it's set up. And you can see the kitchen that looks just like the Downton Abbey kitchen and the bathrooms. And so it was easy to imagine that as being a private residence in 1925. But again, walking through it and you see the textures and the sense of the furniture polish and things like that. So there was that. And of course, the first part is set in the house where I'm sitting in Keswick, Virginia, which was built about 1830. So as far as researching the first part, I read a lot about local folklore and just sort of asked families who'd been here for a while if they knew any moonshining stories, and they did. And then the second part in New York, I researched the New York Biltmore Hotel, which doesn't exist anymore. But then when I needed places for May to live, I used a church-run boarding house that I lived in the early 80s when I was in graduate school, and my first very grotty shared studio walk-up apartment on East 85th Street. So for setting, certainly, I used places that I knew for the most part. And then, as Lindsay said, I read a lot of books. I read, Lindsay doesn't have as much of a chance to do this as I do writing in the 20th century, but I can read magazines and novels that were published during that time. And that gives you a lot of ideas about everyday life, which is something I really love to learn about when I'm reading historical fiction.
You guys had some questions for each other. Do you want to start that?
Sure. Yeah.
Well, I'll ask my first one first, because I think it's a good transition, Liza. So I know you, we both have these interesting objects that are at the center of our main character's identity quest. And I wondered if you could talk about how you found the broken doll that became so important to many.
Yeah, I actually, I have it. I hope can you see it?
Yeah, little face.
Okay, so, I said the house is really old, and I find stuff in the dirt all the time, antique bottles and horseshoes and hinges and broken pottery and porcelain, all in the dirt around here, because people used to just throw that into a pile. Mm-hmm. And I think they're sort of treasures, so I keep them all. And one day I was digging in the garden and I found this broken piece of a Victorian era doll's face. And I thought, I wonder whose doll this was. And what was that little girl's life like here at Keswick Farm 100 or more years ago? And then when I was trying to come up with my main character, I thought, oh, yes, I'm going to write about the girl who owned that doll. And that set me wondering, how did the doll get broken? And, was it thrown down the stairs? Was it broken by a pesky older brother, as mine would have been? Or, was it, did she just grow too old for dolls and forget about it? So that became something of a totem for the novel, as did your lover's eye jewelry.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was curious to know which came first, if you were already writing the story and then you found it, or so that's interesting to know.
I had found it not long before I really sat down and started mapping out this novel, and it just sort of clicked. At that time, when I started, I had made a tabletop out of all these pieces, a mosaic tabletop out of all these pieces of broken pottery and porcelain. And I was sitting on my porch and I went to put my drink down, and literally there was the doll's face staring at me from this tabletop. So, woo-woo. Anyway. Yeah. So, which leads me to, well, this is not.
Wait, before you do that, before we go a little further, Lindsay, can you tell us about the lover's eye? What is that?
Oh, yeah, sure.
Mm-hmm.
So it was actually more of a trend in the 1800s in Georgian England. But the idea was that George, before he was king and when he was still the prince, he had a Catholic lover that his family did not approve of. And so he had this set of eye-shaped brooches made, where they each got just the portrait of their eye, and they could wear it under their lapel or tuck it somewhere secretly. And then you could look into your lover's eye anytime, but nobody would know who it was. Mm-hmm. So even if mom caught you, she wouldn't know that it was the Catholic girl. So it started this trend then in England, where people would do it to memorialize someone who'd passed away, all different kinds of things. But they think, the experts think, that the first ones were actually made in Paris in the late 1700s. And so I thought I had the perfect couple that the first set was made for.
That is absolutely fabulous and super romantic. I love it. Liza, you were going to ask a question?
Oh, well, I was actually going to ask her about the lover's eye. I've seen some of them on Pinterest and stuff, and they'll have like a lock of hair curled into the back, some of them, but you're right. Most of the ones I've seen are from the 1800s, but I love the way you work that into your plot. It really, it just, I love little things like that, things we find in our research that end up being a whole subplot of their own. So one thing I wanted to ask you, Lindsay, Hélène sees some terrible things and she loses life, her whole life. I mean, as she knows it. And I was fascinated by how you made it so plausible that she goes from an aristocratic existence to very simple, working in a bookshop, and I thought you really pulled that off. But what I'm wondering is, how do you think a modern day 19-year-old, and both of our heroines are 19, how do you think a modern day heroine or 19-year-old might handle what Hélène experienced?
That's a good question. And I think so much of how we handle what we experience comes from our family life and what we've experienced up to that point, So I think a lot of times when people get pushed into situations like that, nobody's ready, and people respond in so many different ways depending on their personalities and and their upbringings. And I think about, over and over again, the world goes to war and teenagers are forced into these situations of losing everything or going out to the front lines, and I think in some ways you just I think modern teenagers would probably rise to the occasion, just like they did in the past. I think they're resilient, and, we want to have a good future. We want things to change, and I think teenagers throughout time have seen that. And stepped up. I think social media makes it easier and harder, makes everything easier and harder. I think people now, you feel like it's easier to have your voice heard in some ways, and harder in other ways, because, you can send a tweet out into the forest, but if nobody hears it, but I think teenagers and adults, we handle those things when they come up, and we come together and we rethink what we want our lives and our future lives to look like. So, and hopefully now we have that advantage of looking back on the past, which is why I think it's so important to write historical fiction that's accessible for teens. Mine always ends up in that sweet spot of crossover where it's upper YA crossover into adult. But I think, hopefully as modern teenagers, as modern people, we have that benefit of looking back and seeing those people's mistakes, seeing how things turned out, and then being able to think about, okay, how can we do better? So hopefully we do better.
So working in a library, did that help you figure out when you wanted to write, because you can see what kids are reading, and I really wish we had this historical novel that took place here with this specific character who made these choices. Did it help your book come more into focus because you worked in a library? I'm hoping you say yes.
Yes and no, because at the time that I wrote it, I was not working at the library.
Oh.
I was home with my kids. I was a stay-at-home mom. Now that I'm working in the library, yes. In all my other projects, I'm looking okay, what are the holes that we have in our collection? How can I make sure I'm not telling the story that's already being told really well by somebody else? That I'm finding that story that needs to be told. So yes, as I'm working on my projects now, definitely. But just not when I wrote this one.
Okay, who else has a question?
I wanted to ask Liza about Rocky, because he's one of my favorite characters in the story. And I love how he has so much that he's dealing with, so much discrimination because he's Black, he's gay, and yet he's this like warm and buoyant force for May. Like he's there for her and he's such a solid rock for her. And I love him. And I wondered if he was based on a real person that you came across in your research, or if he is completely fictional.
Oh, good question. Thank you. I'm glad you like Rocky. He's one of my favorite characters. He was fun to write, and I would say he's a composite. And he started out. When I saw this picture of. This is the young Duke Ellington in the early 1920s. And he's so debonair and suave looking and handsome. And so in my mind writing, this is what Rocky looked like to me. And then I in my research, I came across the story of Madam C.J. Walker, who had a hair academy in Harlem. And she became one of the wealthiest women in America by developing a line of hair care and hair care treatments.
Oh, yeah, I know who you're talking about.
Yeah, they did a documentary about her this year.
Yeah.
So I thought, yes, he's going to go to her academy in Harlem. And of course, you know, there was a lot of racism going on then. And he came from Alabama. And I didn't want to I didn't want to just skim over it. So I made sure that every instance of racism I included actually came from history. And for instance, Rocky tells a story in Paris of going to a restaurant with his lover Philippe, and an obnoxious American tourist screams at him that he should be in the kitchen. And that actually happened to Josephine Baker. And then there's another scene where a group of African Americans with May are not allowed to go up the elevator of the Biltmore Hotel in the main lobby. They have to use the service elevator. And that came from the story of Harry T. Burleigh, who was a turn of the century singer, African American, and he had that experience in New York. So when I found these historical instances, I felt like I could weave them into the story. And of course, that shapes his character. He coming to Paris, as Josephine Baker did, you know, he finds a freedom to be himself, to be an African American who's gay, and he's accepted, and he stays in Paris, as Josephine Baker did, because they're accepted there, and life is much more pleasant and easy. So yeah, he's a composite, I would say.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was going to ask something similar. Where did you get the idea for the nanny who puts the idea of revolution into your character's mind?
That's a good question. I'm trying to remember. I mean, I knew that I wanted Hélène to be caught between these two worlds. I didn't want it to be an easy choice for her, like, oh yeah, I'm gonna go chop some heads off, or I'm gonna go run away with my rich family. I really wanted her to be a thoughtful character who was caught between. And so I knew I needed to give her some seeds of that when she was little, and that it needed to be realistic, you know, because realistically, what would cause you to be dissatisfied with a life that's really pretty cushy, you know? So I thought about that, that maybe someone would come in at that time, you know, and it was very common for aristocratic families to hire a governess for their daughters, at least up to a certain point, you know, so they would be marriageable. So I just thought she would be a fun way to introduce that to Hélène. Liza,
what were you going to ask?
Oh, I was going to ask about the design of your book, Lindsay. I think it's so beautiful. And as I said, Blackstone makes just the most beautiful books. And the where's even the end papers are an antique map of Paris. I mean, it's just absolutely beautiful. And I saw on Instagram that your cover designer actually made the brooch and you did a giveaway. Tell me about, well, I want to know, were you able to collaborate on the design, and how did you work with the cover designer?
Yeah, I loved working with Zena. We worked with Zena Keynes, and I have really appreciated everything that Blackstone does. They involve the author, and I love that. I always feel like they are respectful of my vision, and they want my feedback, which is amazing. So they had put me in touch with Zena, and she said, "Do you have any elements of the story that you would want in there?" And I said, "Yeah, I want the brooch on there because it's cool." So she said, "Okay, great. I think I can do something with it." So she went to town and she showed me a couple different designs that were all gorgeous. But I really liked that one. So we chose that together. And she did the end papers. That was a map that we had included when I worked with my editor, that we had found one that would show the different bridges in Paris. And it was the design team that decided to put that in as the end papers, but I loved it. And Zena, in addition to doing book design, is also a sculptor. So she emailed me and said, "Hey, would it be okay with you if I sculpted a couple of these for your giveaway?" And it's like, yes, that would be very okay. So she made several of them, and they used it for the book trailer that Blackstone made. That's on YouTube if you want to take a look at it. But they used one of Zena's brooches there, and we gave a few away with the Goodreads giveaway, and I raffled one off at my launch party too. So it was so cool to have it physically there. It was a really neat prop, and I just loved that she took that extra step to make something special. So
it's beautiful.
Cool. Yeah. Jeez Louise. Looking for your book trailer. What else? What else we got? These are great questions. Let's keep this going.
All right. So I want to know a little bit more about your Instagram page, Liza. You've got all these awesome photos, and I love it. I tune in to see what you're going to post every day. So
thank you. It's become my new hobby, actually, and I signed up for this planning service called Later, where you can store media and write the captions in advance and map out what's going to sit next to what and when things are posted, and then automatically post stuff. So I spend like an hour on Sunday morning planning my Instagram feed for the week, and then it all just posts automatically. So it's great. But I really think, especially in the time of COVID, with all of us spending more time on social media, that it's helped me to connect to a lot of people that I wouldn't have otherwise. And I feel like now I have Instagram friends, like I'm wishing them happy birthday and stuff. I've never met them, and I probably never will. But I love how creative Instagram is. I love Pinterest too, but I love the interaction of Instagram. And so it really has become a hobby. And I post every Sunday, I post something about a scene from my book, the research and stuff. And it's just fun. I need to start actually gathering things for the next book now, and start posting about that at some point. I don't know.
Now, the images that you find, are they images that you're using as you're researching, or just things that are interesting to you?
They're a lot of things I use for research, and I did a fashion history lecture last year at the Historical Novel Society conference. So I had a whole trove of fashion pictures and research. So I feed those in, and art. You can go now on a lot of the museums are letting you have internet access because of COVID. So it's a real mix of stuff, and anything that I find interesting, I put on there, and
Like anybody who likes that aesthetic will love your books because it's just that same vibe. It's the same feel. I love it.
Well,
Leslie, you didn't mention you have a fashion background earlier.
Oh, no, I didn't. Yeah, so way back when I after college, I went to the Fashion Institute of Technology in New York, and then I went to work for Ralph Lauren in New York. And so that was in the 80s, in the early 80s. I mean, just ages and ages ago. So that was my first career. Yeah. I didn't start writing until I was in my early 50s.
We have a question, by the way.
Oh.
Liza, I saw your book trailer. I was impressed. How did you decide to do it like that? Were there images you that you used? Did you do it, or did Blackstone do it?
Blackstone didn't do one for me. I did my own, and I did it on Canva, which is another great resource. I did it, and thank you for that comment. That's really very nice of you to say, questioner. And so I did it on Canva, and I found music that was in the public domain. And then most of the images on there, a lot of them were my own photographs from research and stuff, but some, had obviously pictures of Josephine Baker and stuff came from research. But yeah, Canva is another really fun thing where you can do PowerPoints and for marketing, it's very creative and intuitive. So yeah, Canva.
Yeah, I use it for everything here at the store. Really do.
Yeah, we use it a good bit at the library and everything too. I didn't need to make a book trailer with it though. I haven't seen your trailer yet, so I have to check it out.
I'm looking it up. I'm not finding it yet.
Is it on YouTube? Are you looking on YouTube?
Yeah.
I have it on my website, and I posted it today on Facebook on the Historical Novel Society.
I'll go back to your website. Let's see here. Anyway, so okay, we got about what's it under on your website?
It's I don't know. I don't know.
Both, by the way, another thing your books have in common is you both take great pictures.
Thank you.
And shots are fabulous.
I got you mean the author pictures?
Yeah.
Oh, thank you. I was in Paris last October when I had that picture taken, and I almost didn't do it because I was thinking, oh, I'll just use a picture I have, and it got down to be like the last day, and I had researched photographers before I went over there and talked to one, and he was English, but he lived in Paris, and he was really great. And I called him, and he said, well, I'm busy all day. I can meet you at 5 or something. So it was cold, and we went to the Tuileries and walked around, and then the picture we ended up using was like one of the last images, and I was so glad that I did that, especially now that who knows when I can go back there again. But now I'm so glad now that I went ahead and did that when I was there.
Lindsay, yours is cute. Did you take it? It looks like you're having a great time at a party.
No, actually, I had someone take it. So in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, which is pretty close to where I live, there is this old Masonic ballroom that is mostly forgotten about, but it's from the late 1700s, from when Lancaster was first founded, and it has the painted ceiling, and it looks very French, Versailles-ish, and lots of cool wallpaper. So we ended up going there and took a bunch. So.
That's very cool. I want somebody to come take photos of me, except I don't. But I really
awkward. It's like you have a camera in your face and you're. I don't know.
Feel awkward. I'm much better at taking a selfie of myself than anybody is at taking a photo of me. We've had photo shoots here in the bookstore for graduations and stuff. Okay, more questions.
Well, I want to know about the next book. Is it a continuation of May's story?
Oh, well, yes, no spoilers, but it takes place 6 years later in 1931 and 1932 during the the very bottom of the Great Depression. And it's set in Boston and Virginia. And May will be back, and some of the familiar characters will be back. But then it's a dual narrative. So there's parallel stories of another character from Boston, and about halfway through, the two main characters meet, and then their lives intersect, and they have a great effect on each other. But it, I've heard authors say, oh, this character popped into my head fully formed. And I'd be like, well, woo woo, that's good for you. But then it happened to me. And this character sort of started knocking. I was doing research. I knew I wanted this book to be set during the Great Depression. It's called In All Good Faith. And I started doing research, and I kept getting these sort of flashes of this teenage girl, and I kept finding these weird things in my research that would circle back that could be a teenage girl, and then it narrowed down to Boston. And then finally I gave her a name. I'm like, okay, this is supposed to be May's story part 2, but who are you? And once I gave her a name, she sort of blossomed. And then as I started writing her story, I started seeing that what she was going through was parallel to what May was going through, and that there was a plausible way for them to meet and affect each other's lives. So I set the whole thing around the events of the summer of 1932 during the Veterans Bonus March, which was started in Oregon in May of 1932. 8 World War I veterans without jobs set off on foot to ride the rails and to hitchhike, to do anything they could to make their way across the country. And they wanted to petition President Herbert Hoover for the early payment of their war bonuses, which weren't supposed to be paid until 1945. Well, they got a lot of press. And by the time they got to Washington in early June, there were 14,000. And by the end of June, there were 20,000 veterans, and people brought their wives and their children, and they camped out around the Capitol and along the rivers. And of course, it was unsanitary, and it, these people didn't have jobs. It was really a hard summer. Mm-hmm. So I imagine this 16-year-old girl going there with her father. And I thought, what would happen if somehow they were separated and she was left on her own? So what happened was at the end of July, the Senate and Congress had not passed this bill because it would have bankrupted the Treasury at that time. So Herbert Hoover sent Douglas MacArthur in with the cavalry and tanks and tear gas bombs to clear these camps. And in one night, they cleared the camps. People didn't have time to take their belongings, and they just pushed them across the border out of Washington, D.C. So that was, I didn't know about that event in history. It's kind of an embarrassment, in American history. And I thought, wow, what if you put a young girl in there and see what happens to her. So that was sort of the historical event that started the whole story. But yes, back to your question, it is May's story continued. People keep asking me, does she end up with Bird? And I'm not going to tell you. You have to read the book.
You can tell me later, like after.
Right. All right.
By the way, Liza sent me something, and I think I can play it directly from here. Okay. So here's the book trailer for Etiquette for Runaways.
Oh, you're not getting the volume.
Yeah, where's the volume? I was pretty impressed that I managed to load it up to the video. So, I get points for that. I also put a link in our comments to Lindsay's book trailer. And I also put in here, if you guys are interested, if anybody's interested in buying either book, you can buy it from us. We have them in stock. Currently, we have Etiquette for Runaways autographed, and Lindsay's going to send us Nemesis and the Swan book plates as well. So if anybody is interested in that. Do you guys have a favorite bookstore that you like to shop at, independent bookstore?
Yeah, we have a wonderful bookstore on our downtown mall in Charlottesville called New Dominion Bookshop, and it opened in 1924, the same year my book is set. And they have been very supportive of my book, and that was where I had my first and only live reading in February. So that's our only indie bookstore right now.
I put a link to them in our comments.
Thank you.
Do you have one that you shop at?
Yeah, I go to Aaron's Books in Lidditz, and
I think I know them.
Yep, they're awesome. They're a family-owned business right there downtown Lidditz, and Lidditz has been named the coolest small town in America. It's really quite nice.
How do you spell that?
Lititz.
Okay, I've never heard of it.
It's an old Moravian settlement, but now it's a cute little town. And there was the Wilbur Chocolate Factory.
Oh,
so it would smell like chocolate. It's great.
So I want to ask you, Lindsay, what are you working on now? What's your next project?
Well, I am in a totally different time period for the next one. I am working on a dual timeline story also, but mine is set in 1911 and modern day New York. And so I saw this photograph as I was looking. There's a scar on my arm that I wanted to get tattooed. I was tired of looking at it, and I was like, I want to turn this into something I like, and take control over that. So I started looking up vintage tattoo ideas just because I like vintage stuff. And I saw this photo of Maud Wagner, who was the first female tattoo artist in the United States. And I just could not stop looking at this photo. She's there in this tube top with all these tattoos and just looking at the camera like, I dare you to have a problem with me, and so I started looking into tattoo history, and it was so interesting. So that kind of got me down this road. The character in the 1911 timeline is a tattooed freak on the boardwalk at Coney Island at Dreamland Park, which burned down. And the modern day one is actually learning about his life, and they converge. So
that sounds really interesting.
That's great. Is that the same Dreamland that is in Charlie Lovett's Escaping Dreamland?
I think it is, but not the exact same time period, because I don't think it includes when it burns.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's another Blackstone author, and his book is Escaping Dreamland, historical fiction.
Read, but I have not read it yet.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, I love Blackstone. They always set up the best author events. All right, guys. Well, it's come to the end here, and I've thoroughly enjoyed this. As I said, we have copies of Lindsay and Liza's books in stock if anybody's interested. I always like to say we would love for you to support us. Buy the books from us, please. If not, support your local independent bookstore. We've got a couple suggestions here. We have Aaron's Books and New Dimension Bookshop. Either of those will probably have copies in stock. If they don't have them in stock, they can get them in stock for sure. As I said, support your local independent bookstore. It doesn't have to be us. We would like it to be us, but it doesn't have to be us. All right, guys. Any parting remarks before we head out?
Thank you for having us, Kim. It's always fun to talk to you, and hope I can talk to you when my next book comes out.
I would love that. Maybe in person, maybe this way. We'll just see what happens.
And Lindsay, I loved getting to know you better tonight and hearing more about your book.
Yeah,
it's great to get to know you too. And I loved Etiquette for Runaways. So I get a copy. It's beautiful. So
they're both beautiful books, and I'll be hand selling the heck out of both of them.
Thank you.
All right, guys. Well, good night.
Good night. Thank you, Kim.